So I would like to point out the return to normalcy, the whole immunization question. Do we immunize students? Do we require that? Do we require it of teachers? What's going to happen now with the Delta variant? Turned on the news last night to find out that my state, Kentucky, is leading the nation, one of the leaders in the Delta variant. What's that going to mean? And NTI, what is our return to? Are we going to allow students to be online virtually and learn? When? How? What about teachers? And I'd like to also refer to Dr. Huggins' presentation of yesterday, where he talked about the overwhelming problems we may face with student depression. And it may be difficult to recognize that. So you may want to take a listen to Dr. Huggins. And I'm very happy today that Sister Dale McDonald has joined us. Sister Dale is by far the national authority on Catholic education and legislation. And so thank you very much, Sister Dale, for being with us today. Maybe we can go to you. You can introduce yourself, Sister Dale.
Thank you very much. First, a disclaimer, I am not an attorney, but I deal with a lot of these issues that we may be talking about today in terms of the legislative process and some of the regulatory pieces that come from various government agencies. So I'm happy to be with you. My presentation dealing with the legislation and the federal issues is available as part of this presentation on the on-demand session. So I'm happy to join my panelists here who are all our attorneys who can give you the real legal definitions or answers. Thank you.
Mary?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Sister Angie and fellow panelists. My name is Mary McManus McElroy, and I, yes, am an attorney, but I work as an assistant superintendent for the Newark Archdiocese. We have general counsel, and I work with them. They usually ask me about process questions for how things will actually affect the schools that we work with here in the Archdiocese. Certainly happy to be part of this panel.
Thank you, Mary. She's a valuable asset and friend. And Father Brian is our only canon lawyer here today, I believe. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, fellow panelists. I'm Father Brian Pham. I'm a Jesuit priest. I teach law and I run the general practice in Indian Law Clinic here at Gonzaga University. And I'm also a canon lawyer. So my area is really how canon law and US civil law intersect with one another. So oftentimes I think Catholic universities or Catholic schools in the US, we operate under two different legal systems simultaneously. And sometimes those systems conflict with each other. And so my area is to look at how or what you do when these areas conflict. And so I'm happy to be here. I think this is my third time being with this panel, and I'm happy to answer any question people may have. Thank you.
Armando, Dr. Paz. I think you need to unmute yourself.
Yep, got it. Good, thank you, sister. Good morning, everyone. I'm a practicing attorney. I've been a court-appointed minors counsel a number of times. I teach at LMU, Loyola Marymount University, and I've been a substitute judge throughout Los Angeles County for a number of years. I also do a little bit of mediation. And I'm now emeritus from the St. Thomas More Law Society of Los Angeles.
So we are going to take questions now. I think that Jonathan is going to read them to us.
Feel free to leave your comments in the chat or your questions in the Q&A. This is really designed to be an open forum. Any questions you have to kind of glean some insights from the expertise on the panel. So anything you're wrestling with and your legal questions, feel free to submit those in the Q&A or comment in the chat.
First question is from Sister Margaret Johnson. And she said, are any of you aware of a good confidentiality statement It would be wise for volunteers and staff to sign as well as those in our school. There are a lot of them out there. Sister, if you want to send me an email, I will send you a few of them. But perhaps our other members might have something to say about confidentiality statements and holding things confidential and what should be held confidential. And I'm going to ask Mary, because she's an assistant super or associate superintendent, to maybe respond from the superintendent's point of view.
Sure, thank you, Sister. In our ministerial agreements with administrators and in particular with teachers, we actually did insert language this year reminding teachers of their obligation to hold things in confidence, particularly sensitive matters that might have to do with student situations or, perhaps other, personnel things they might inadvertently overhear, that idea of staff room conversations. So we have put that in our agreements that is a duty of our teacher ministers to hold things in confidence.
Anyone else have a thought on it? Father Brian, I know that I just read recently that there's been some revisions to canon law about the sex abuse situation and duty to report. I don't know if you could give us an update on that at all.
So the Pope recently changed some law, or not changed, but clarify some canons in the Code of Canon Law about how or when to report abuse. And I think, again, this is just to really emphasize or to highlight the gravity of this. It mainly has to do with, I think, people who work in the church. So bishops, priests, and then I think in that would also include school teachers as well. It's still being sent around and people are still discussing and debating about what that means exactly. So I think, again, I think the main thing is that to understand that sex abuse is a serious issue. The Pope wants the reporting of the abuse to be part of the process in canon law. How does that get implemented in our schools? It's going to be up to the local bishops and how they interpret that. So I think we're going to see some more guidelines in the coming months about what that means. But I think, yeah, at the moment, I think just be aware that it is going to be out there and that there's an expectations that teachers and people who work in schools will find a way to incorporate into their policy about reporting of sex abuse.
Dr. Paz, I know you have long history and experience with family court cases and things like that. Sometimes teachers have questions, I know, and principals about what do we do when a lawyer writes and says, I want you to send me a written statement about the other party in a divorce situation. I think teachers run into this all the time. Mom and dad are going to get divorced. Mom's attorney writes and says, please send me a letter telling me what you see about the mother, et cetera, et cetera. And most teachers and principals are rightly very apprehensive when they receive those letters. So we're really fortunate to have a judge here today. So maybe you could share some of your experience with us in that area of confidentiality.
Thank you, Sister. I'm only a substitute judge. I don't get the full
Well, a judge,
role.
though.
I'll only get the fill in. The orders are good. Whatever I sign is as good as a regular order. In these cases, what the one party is doing, it's sometimes we think of it as a rather selfish request, because now you're putting that teacher not only in between two parties, you're sometimes putting them in between three, mom, dad, and the child. The child may not want something like that as well. So now you've really put the teacher in a bad spot, in a no-win spot, because no matter what the teacher does, one or two of the three parties is going to be upset based on whatever's written. So unless there's a subpoena, unless you're brought into court, I would say avoid these requests at all cost. although sometimes teachers want to favor one parent based on what they see. I remember what Judge Ken Black used to say here in Los Angeles, that Mother Teresa did not marry Attila the Hun. And what he was trying to say there is things are not always what they seem. One party isn't as saintly as you might think, and the other side isn't as bad as one party would make them out. So unless you have all the facts, it's very difficult for you to make that kind of recommendation without seeing everything that's going on. And again, keep in mind, the number one goal is best interest of the child. And sometimes where you have good intentions, you could be making things worse.
So would it be safe to say, Dr. Paz, that absent a subpoena requiring you to come to court and testify, you do not have an obligation to comply with that attorney's request?
Not knowing the laws in 50 states, I would say as a general answer, that is correct, and avoid it. And if anything, if you're in an archdiocese where you have a general counsel, pick up the phone and call your general counsel.
Absolutely.
They will be happy to hear from you in these cases. By the way, one thing, sister, just so that you know, you're getting some questions both in the chat and the Q&A. I know that may be hard
in
to
the
toggle
chat.
between all of them.
Okay, I'm seeing them in the Q&A.
Yeah,
All
you've
right,
got a number in the Q&A.
I think our
in the chat.
second question, unless someone wants to weigh in on that question of what do you do when you get these notices from or letters from attorneys, and sometimes they bypass the principal, they just go directly to the teacher. And so I think it's important just to say that the teacher needs to consult with the principal, and if it's a parish school, the pastor needs to know what's going on. Sometimes it's we're all so busy that we kind of forget some of the things we need to do. So our next question says, if we have a registered nurse on staff, can she ask our teachers whether or not they are vaccinated? I'll start this off if it's okay. I'm getting that question constantly. And so I have done an unofficial and probably unscientific poll of people that I know, superintendents, teachers, and attorneys across the country. And I'm getting this statement that yes, you can ask the teachers, but they don't have to be vaccinated. People can come up with, they can produce a letter from a doctor saying for whatever reason, they're not gonna be vaccinated. The harder question is, can you require it? And what I'm hearing from people everywhere is they're not going to do it. They will ask for the vaccination status, but they will not require people to be vaccinated. Now, I don't know what will happen if the Delta variant comes over, and it seems to be in some ways worse than the ones that the COVID-19 itself that we've been dealing with. So I guess you're the only person we have from the superintendent's office, Mary. So I don't know if you would mind just telling us a little bit about what the Diocese of Newark, which is certainly one of our biggest and most influential dioceses, is doing.
Not at all, sister. At this point, there is no decision made to require that anyone be vaccinated. The principals can ask if teachers have been or staff have been vaccinated. And in fact, the state of New Jersey just published, they're calling it the Road Forward, which is guidance from the State Health Department and the State Department of Ed regarding reopening of schools in September. And one of the points in that guidance document is the strong suggestion that schools keep track of those who have been vaccinated. So that seems to be a theme that will be playing out, and we'll see what happens with mask mandates. For example, in our Chancery building, if you have been vaccinated and you upload proof of vaccination, many places use one of those apps that tracks that information, then you don't have to wear a mask any longer within the Chancery building. So it seems like something along those lines will probably play out, but we are very much waiting for what the governor will determine will be effective for all schools come September.
Well, Brian, I know you're at Gonzaga, so perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what's happening at the university level about in-class, in-person attendance. I don't think there'll be too many on that have residential schools, but could you tell us what's going on at the college?
So I'm here at Gonzaga University, but a mile away from here is Gonzaga Prep, which is our high school. And again, both institutions are very similar in terms of how we are handling all of this. So we rely heavily, right, with our local county health advisors. We want to be in sync with the other schools, the public schools, as much as we can. But we all, because we are private institutions, we have some leeway around that. So we are anticipating both the university and the high school to have in-person classes in the fall. We are also anticipating that students do not have to wear a mask when they're in, and there's no social distancing. I would say one thing that both institutions have done pretty well is really just communicate this message to the families, the students, the incoming students, especially, as well as new teachers and new faculty. So just be transparent about it and really explain to them what is the policy, because people will have questions, right? And then they don't know who to turn to. So both the president of the high school as well as the president of the university have issued letters explaining to people what the policy is. And then of course also make exceptions, right? Because of religious and personal exception, people can apply for that. So just be very clear with people about what the policy is. Especially if it's a private school, it doesn't get reported in the media about what the policy is that often. And so I think, principals and teachers, as well as presidents of institutions, should really report this and let people know what the policy is, so that people know what to anticipate and know who to ask should have any questions. I've encountered quite a number of students who are very concerned about having to be vaccinated because of personal reasons. And I think, again, there should be an avenue to address those concerns and those fears. So it's important to keep that in mind.
And we have a couple other questions. One related to vaccinations. What do you as a panel expect to see regarding vaccinations for COVID being required in our schools? We've been talking about teachers, but what do you see about students? What I'm saying is that people are saying they're not requiring it for students. Some cases they're not even asking. What would be your thought on that? Anyone?
I would say that we would not require it as a diocese. However, we would follow what the state does. So if the state required it, a COVID vaccination, then we would obviously be expected to adhere to what the state required, just as in a regular schedule of vaccinations as required by the state health department.
Dr. Paulus, would you have any comments? I don't seem to see you, or I don't know if you're muted or, okay. Sister Dale, have you been hearing anything about this?
No, I haven't been contacted. NCEA has not really dealt directly with that issue since it's a local issue. We would refer people back to their school or to the archdiocese, the diocese superintendent's office. Most of our schools, I believe, are following local health official policies. At least that's the last that we heard in some of the surveys that we did.
I think it's also important to keep in mind that I think, there may be a national federal policy as well as local or state as well as county or municipal policy. So you got to be clear about which one you're following, because they may be guided by different guidelines. So just be very clear and be transparent with your families about which policy you're following. I know here in Washington State, when we opened, the whole state opened up last week, we were at about 68% in at the level of the state, but federally, like, looking at the federal number, they look at us as 72% vaccination, right? So it's important that you understand which one you're following, the federal, state, as well as county, right? So wherever your school is located, keep that in mind as well.
I could let Jonathan know that Dr. Paz says his screen is frozen, so I don't know if there's anything we can do about it, but I know that you could be in touch with Dr. Paz, and I will make some
Right,
information.
Yeah,
do
I'm in
that.
touch with Dr. Paz behind the scenes, so we'll hope to get him back on as soon as possible.
Right.
And I'm seeing
Okay.
some more questions in the Q&A regarding school choice, and there's a couple from Valerie here, who's asking, in this time when parents are unhappy with the way public schools have handled education
Can
during
I
COVID.
interrupt you just for one
Go ahead.
second? Finish this vaccination question of, are you required to tell parents how many of your teachers are vaccinated? I don't know of any law that would require you to tell them that. And frankly, I mean, we would not give out any teachers' medical information. I consider that medical information. So go ahead, Jonathan. If you could ask the questions, it'd be really helpful. Go ahead.
Sure. Do you want to stick with
Yes, go ahead.
Valerie's asking, many families are choosing Catholic schools. However, tuition remains an obstacle for many families. Are there any new updates on school choice options for Catholic schools? Or what more can we do to advocate for greater school choice or including Catholic schools in those school choice options?
And I'm going to ask Sister Dale to lead off because you are the expert on this.
Right. Well, there are 32 states and the District of Columbia that do have some kind of a school choice option that includes private schools. There are 2 more that are being currently resolved by the U.S. Supreme Court, both Vermont and Maine. The Maine case, the court agreed to take up next term. And in both Vermont and Maine, the state statutes say that if you are in a school district, in a district that does not run a high school, but pays for you to go somewhere else to a high school in the state, your tuition would be paid, except if you are in a faith-based school. And so following the Espinoza decision on the Montana case back last spring, this court said that it's a breach of your right to free exercise to put a limit on private faith-based schools not being able to participate. We're hoping with the Maine case that, we'll finally put an end to this whole Lane Amendment piece, but that's yet to be seen. The important thing that we learned, particularly in the last administration, when we had a Republican governor, a Republican Congress, and both houses of Congress, that school choice on a national level is probably not going anywhere. Unfortunately, since the late 80s, school choice on a national level has become a partisan issue. Once President Reagan took it up, it became a very politicized, and yet, which we found out in the last administration, not all Republicans even support some kind of government assistance for school choice. So it's really on the local level, at the state level, that you have to get involved in creating state choice programs. On the on-demand session that I did for this law symposium, toward the end of that presentation, there's information about who has school choice, where it is, what some of the principals should be involved in the designing of school choice programs. So basically, you need to have local and state organizations beginning that process. And there are, there are national organizations that help at the state level working on school choice programs, like Catholic Education Partners, like I just lost it. But there are a couple of organizations, and the American Center for School Choice, a lot of them do offer how to organize on a state level. And that's really where you need to put your efforts. And the effort would be on some kind of a tax credit, some kind of a scholarship program, an education savings account. working toward getting the parent to get some assistance. Again, it's legal. We found that out in the Cleveland case back in the 90s, that if the parent directs where the money goes, it is constitutionally allowable. And then with the support from Espinoza and coming forward on some of the other cases, we've got a good legal case for helping parents, but it will have to go through a state operation. So American Federation for Children is what I was intending to say a few minutes ago. So I think you need to, look toward that. The Catholic Education Partners, as I said earlier, which is working with the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, helping directly with state efforts. So I hope that's helpful. I would say, again, don't count on a national program, work on a state level.
As
Sister,
Sister
just in
Dale-
case,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead,
as Sister
Mary.
Dale has said about the local efforts, what we've done in New Jersey is we've working through our New Jersey Catholic Conference and New Jersey CAPE, the Council of American Private Education. What we did was we had our non-public school groups come together, and we actually placed an ad in several of the newspapers throughout the state that said we did it. And we highlighted all the different types of non-public education in the state and how we were open, full-time, in-person instruction with all the proper modifications. And what we did was we created a landing page so that we were saying we did it, we had all these things, and if you want to know more about a non-public school near you, contact us. And that landing page, then we use it as a little clearinghouse to refer interest out to the other non-public school groups. And then we've asked all of these groups to push this out on their social media. So we're elevating our presence that we were here and we had these in-person options. And we've asked our principals to collect stories from the public school families who came to Catholic schools when their public schools were closed. There were a few lawsuits here in New Jersey where parents sued their local public school district because they were not in person. So we're trying to, on a grassroots level, capitalize on those stories so we can bring those to state legislators as we continue to push for, as Sister Dale is saying, forms of school choice, which mostly would be, tax credits.
right. Kentucky has a bill that passed the Kentucky House and Senate. The governors vetoed it, and it is now in the court system. So I think the Blaine Amendment is still alive and well in some parts of the country anyway. And Sister Dale, I was going to ask you, for people who might not know, could you just give a brief definition of the Blaine Amendment?
The Blaine Amendment is named after a former U.S. Senator who tried to get on the national level a bill passed that would not allow any public money to be spent on any religious organization. And that's defined in many different ways, what public monies are and the ways in which they can, frame that. So some frame it in terms of the how they list assistance directly or indirectly, but basically it came out of that nativist movement, the Know Nothing movement back in the 1830s and 40s that basically looked on those who came from parts of Europe that were Catholic as the invasion of the Pope's troops here to take over the country, etc. A very hateful rhetoric really toward particularly the Catholic Church. And so while it never passed on a national level as an amendment to the Constitution, it did take up conversation in many states, and like 38 different states did pass these Blaine amendments that prohibited any religious money, any religious institute from receiving money directly or indirectly. Now, whether they named it specifically as churches, schools, organizations differs by state constitutions.
And Dr. Paz, I'm glad you got back on. There was a little technical difficulty. Would you like to add anything? Maybe he didn't get back on. Thought I saw his picture.
He was on, but he's gone again. Mhm.
Okay. Any thoughts, Father Brian? On this subject?
None on the subject.
Okay, then shall we move on, Jonathan?
Sure. There's a follow-up question. Has Espinoza versus Montana opened avenues for school choice through tax credit scholarships?
Really, it opened opportunities for whatever the state offers for scholarships. It has to offer it for faith-based schools. If they offer for any private school, it has to be offered for all private schools. So yes, it could be any kind of assistance. It just depends on how the program is structured. But you can't exclude a faith-based organization from equal treatment along with others who are similarly situated, even although not religious. So yes, I mean, hopefully there's a slight legal piece that they're fighting about following Espinoza, which opened a little door. Yes, you have to offer an opportunity, but then what they're fighting about, particularly in the Vermont case, how much do you have to subsidize? So yes, you can offer a scholarship, but do they get the whole scholarship? Do they make some determination that 30% of the day is religious, so you don't pay for 30% of that? So there's an opening there, which I think possibly the main case may be looking at.
And that is exactly the situation in Kentucky. Not that Kentucky leads with a lot of things, but it is about scholarships. And people were very hopeful that kids could get somewhere between $500 and $1,200 aid, but now it's in the court system. So that is an issue. And Dr. Paz, can you add anything, maybe from your experience in California?
Sister, my computer's been frozen for about 10 minutes and I just came back on.
Okay, we're talking
So-
about school choice and the question of how we see it moving in the country, I suppose would be fair.
I can't tell you that I have any news on that. By the way, my computer froze when we left off with you asking Father Pham about vaccinations. And I don't know where that went, but I can chime in a little bit here in
Okay, go
terms of
ahead.
at LMU, we are going to be requiring students to be vaccinated, but there are going to be exceptions. And for those that fall under the exceptions, they're going to have to go through a daily check, temperature check, and a verification that you haven't been exposed to anybody and so on. Well, I can't imagine that very many of our students are going to want to go through that. That just becomes cumbersome every day. So I think ultimately they're going to opt for getting the vaccine. And sorry about all the computer issues. I've just
No,
been
it's
frozen
okay.
for 10 minutes and missed a
Happens.
lot. I'm sure plenty of good information.
Thank you. Jonathan?
There's another question here regarding special education. So is there more we can do on the local level to advocate for increased services for students with special education needs? We receive minimal stipends. It ties our hands in welcoming students who require more specialized instruction.
I'm going to ask Mary from her superintendency position.
Sure.
What do you
I would
see?
say to be, first of all, to be very vigilant and rigorous about child find. Make sure that all the principals realize what that entails, which is that they should be the district has the obligation to reach out to all the children in the district in regard to those that might be in need of special education services. So whenever there is a student that appears to be in need at the school, the principals need to be really vigilant and rigorous in requesting child find and putting that information before the district. So the first thing would be making sure that students in need of special ed are not overlooked. The other thing is to then make sure at consultation meetings, which I know Sister Dale can certainly speak to very well, making sure that you advocate for the needs of your students under IDEA, those who are classified, and then to look to see what your state offers in terms of any type of special education services. And certainly on the state level, New Jersey is blessed that we do have state programs, but we feel that the funding is very limited, which it always is everywhere. It seems funding is limited. So then to really know what those programs entitle the students to receive and to advocate for their inclusion in those programs, particularly things like basic skills, how are the students testing to be eligible for that, and things of that nature, to really advocate for what you have and to always make the case, that students are able to be served in our schools. Certainly we need, the funding to be able to do that as well as we possibly can.
Mr. Dale?
Yeah, I would also offer the federal money from IDEA is very limited. I mean, now they're talking about almost doubling it in the next budget, so we'll see where that goes. But unfortunately, the IDEA law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, says clearly that students who are parentally placed in a private school are not entitled to services. They're entitled to be evaluated, and they're entitled to be considered for services. But when, when there are like 12 private schools in the district, and for all of those schools, the district only gets something like $40,000, they can spend that $40,000 on one student, or they can spread it out, which they generally do. And so they'll do speech, or they'll do teacher training on how to recognize and work with students with certain learning differences. So that's all that's all that you get out of the federal program. So most kids who qualify for the federal program, who may have a diagnosed disability, don't get anything, frankly. And so it's at the state level where you really need to work. I mean, we will work at the federal level the next time IDEA comes up for reauthorization, which we've tried over the last couple of authorizations to get that part of the law changed. But right now, that is the law. So you need to work at the state level to try to get some services available through state money. When the IDEA bill was up for consideration, when it was reauthorized back, the question of whether or not private schools are entitled, that time they determined that was a federal mandate, an unfunded federal mandate to require the state to do for private schools what it does for public schools. And so that was written into the law that states were not required. They may offer, but they don't have to. And of course, once they know that they may and don't have to, it usually prevails. So work at the state level to get some kind of inclusion in the state programs. And one of the things I would say that's really important when you do that is to try to get the state program to allow services in the school where the child attends. For instance, in Massachusetts, while there is a mandate to serve all students, they have to be served in a neutral site. So many parents forego what their child might be able to obtain because they don't want them taken out of school and sent to a public school during the day to get those services, that kind of thing. So it's important that the child be served where he or she is, and that the state have some responsibility. So that's where you need to work, at the state level.
I think it's really important too to support the parents in their advocacy efforts. Thank you, Sister Dale and Mary. As many of you probably know, I spent many years advocating for one of my nephews who has disabilities. And it is so easy to get discouraged. I've also been with any number of my students who had profoundly disabled students, children, And even in the public schools, I have ended up advocating or representing students and families. Um, I believe that we all want to be inclusive. And it's a hard reality that sometimes we can't meet everybody's needs. And that is a very difficult conversation to have with parents. But if we can present ourselves as partners with the parents, I think that is a really big plus. One thing that I've been saying for a long time, and it may sound a bit harsh, but is for schools to consider putting in their handbooks a statement that everybody is accepted on 1 month or 1 quarter's trial. So it's not, doesn't appear like we are saying to this child who comes in with an IEP that we're not going to accept the IEP, we're going to write our own plan. We're not just saying to him or her, you're on 30 days or a quarter's probation. We're saying it to everybody. And there are other reasons why we may tell parents that they have to take their kids out. Now, I know this is a strange conversation to have, and we're all trying to get more students, but we've all had, I call them the parents from hell, that it's not the kid that's the problem, but it's parents. And a principal recently told me about 2 parents that were divorced from each other, having affairs with other people, and then got in a fight in the parking lot. A really big fight when there were students around. She told them that if it happened again, they would have to withdraw their students. Now, hopefully that's not something that happens all the time, but it's something you might want to put in the back of your mind. If everybody has to do it, nobody gets very upset about it, but it does give you the mechanism to say, this just isn't working. Here's your money back. None of us like to say, here's your money back, but that would be the measure of damages. So I asked Dr. Paz and Father Brian if you want to add anything, special ed discussion. No? Okay, can we have the next question, please, Jonathan?
Sure, another question along the lines of medical issues. So if a parent does not disclose their child's chronic medical illness until after acceptance into a school, do they still have the right to require that teachers learn how to treat their child in case of a medical emergency when there is no school nurse or on staff?
That's a good question. I think one of the things that I suggest people put in their registration forms is a statement asking, does your child have a condition or a situation that will require accommodations? That is not an illegal question. If so, what accommodations will they need? I think it's better to have the discussion before you get the child in there than to say that we'll try anybody. A lot of times parents don't tell you, or sometimes parents don't tell you the true nature of a child's disability. Once the parent comes forward with it, I would make an attempt. I would say, this is what we can do, this is what we can't do. Now, maybe what we can do is not enough in your terms, in which case we probably need to part company. Sometimes we try really hard to accommodate, which is really good, but don't push yourself beyond the ramifications of what you can do. There can be other difficulties in, for example, a parish school, when it's a longtime parishioner, the principal says it just isn't going to work. They go to the pastor. That's why I think it's really important for the principal and the pastor to have a great working relationship and to let each other know. Nobody likes surprises. The principal doesn't want to be surprised because the pastor said, yes, you can come here. And the pastor doesn't want to be surprised that the person comes over and he has no knowledge of what's been going on. So I just like to make a case for good pastor-parent communication. And Mary, I'm sure that the diocese can provide some guidance to people in these areas.
Yes, usually schools will have a question along the lines of what you said, Sister, in the registration materials. So they're asking for the parents to share. And in a situation where parents have not shared, which sadly does happen, then we ask that the school meet with the parents to discuss, what the nature of the issue is when it becomes emergent and how they best can move forward. And then if there is a medical type of plan, that be submitted from the child's physician, that the school and meet with the parents and the school nurse, and if necessary, or legal counsel will review it to make sure that, as you're saying, the school is not overextending itself and promising something that in all practicality that they can't monitor.
Dr. Paz?
In adding to what Sister and Mary have just said, let me start with the premise that, and I try to simplify things. I tell my students, Jesus took 10 commandments and simplified them down to 2, love God, love your neighbor. I tell people the 3 words that will help you understand the law are reasonable, notice, and foreseeable. In this case, the parents didn't give the school notice, yet at the same time, the school has that obligation to make the reasonable accommodations, and twisting the question a little bit around what if this had developed, what if the issue had developed after the child was admitted? Would your answer be any different? You still have to come up with the reasonable accommodations. Now that may be more difficult. Maybe, for example, they would have placed the child in another parish school if the district had been able to, because another school had better facilities. But at this point, you have the problem either way, whether it was beforehand or with notice beforehand or after. You still have to make the reasonable accommodations. Do the best you can, but it's going to come down to one of those other words too. Reasonable. What's reasonable here, even if you didn't have notice?
Sister Dale?
I think that's where a number of things that I've been aware of have happened because of people's definition of reasonable. Inconvenience is not a substitute for reasonable, and because the teacher doesn't like it, that's not, if it can be done without undue financial burden, without completely changing your program, then we make every effort to do so. But to say it's too much trouble in any way you want to disguise that as reasonable, you're opening yourself to a lawsuit. I mean, I've seen that in a couple of cases, so the teacher doesn't want to move a classroom because I've always been in room 22. It's unreasonable for her, but it's not a reasonable accommodation to make to change the classroom so the kid can wheel the wheelchair in, and then next year, go back up to room 22 or whatever. And this is where, the principals need to really work with the teachers to understand, and the superintendents with the principals, that at sometimes we have to be inconvenienced for the good of the child. And that is not unreasonable.
I had a client, it was public school years ago, and the nature of his disability was such that the doctors requested that he be given his work on Friday for the next week, so that because he wasn't taking the medication on the weekend, he could do a better job of organizing everything. And the teacher sat there and said to me, I don't want to do that. I have a sick mother-in-law. What if she dies and I'm not here on Friday? I said, I think we can understand that and that you wouldn't have to worry about it. And she kept on and kept on and kept on. And maybe I shouldn't have said this, but I did. I said, I think the reason we have schools is so that students can learn, not so that teachers have jobs. And I think that's the bottom line. If you have somebody that is just, I don't want to do this, or it's inconvenient. A lot of things are inconvenient. You're right, sister. And although I haven't heard of somebody saying yet, I'm not going to move because I've always been in this room, it wouldn't surprise me to hear it. Father Brian, any thoughts?
Again, I mean, I would go back to the school policy and the school manual. And again, that should really clarify who makes the decision and what is the grievance process. There can always be questions, there can always be requests. And I think as both Sister Dale and Sister Angie stated, right, people don't necessarily understand or even agree on what is consider reasonable. But if it's clear about who gets to make that final decision, then I think that would resolve things really, really, really well. So again, I mean, I think policy, school manual, that should really clarify any kind of confusion that could bring up issues like this in the future.
All right, Jonathan, do we have another question?
Sure, yeah. You touched on this a little bit, but if you have any more thoughts, feel free to chime in. Rosemary Nassif is asking, what recourse does an archdiocese or a school have if the LEA is not willing to allocate or is limiting title funds or federal relief funds that have been designated for private schools? Is, public opinion the most effective recourse?
Sister Dale, you're the expert.
Most effective recourse is to appeal first to the district and then to the federal government. There are odds and the obligation is in the law. And if they are not attending, depending on how it is, you may start like with Title I, you may start with the ombudsman for your state. If you don't get any satisfaction there, you go directly and make a formal complaint in which you say the law says you must do A, B, and C, and you're not doing B and C. If the state does not respond to you within 60 days, then you appeal to the U.S. Department of Education. That is the recourse that's outlined in the law, and that is your best. Public opinion is not really going to do it. The people who are running these programs at the district could care less what the public thinks. So it's what is the legal obligation and who has authority to intervene to make that right.
I would echo Sister
Okay,
Dale. Certainly pressure on the district, and then right away up the chain of command, the county superintendent, the Office of Non-Public Services that we have here in New Jersey, and the ombudsman. The ombudsman here has actually been helpful. So we've had, on balance, a good experience with the ombudsman in New Jersey. And then certainly, keeping the State Department of Ed informed that if this is not resolved, we will file a federal complaint. And then, as Sister said, the last step would be to file that complaint.
Dr. Paz, do you have any experience with this?
Not so much. This is more Mary's area. I'm catching the Brian's comment also in the Father Brian's comment in the chat, and I would appreciate if you have a chance to expand on the confidentiality statement, and I would love a sample if you have anything there concerning the disclaimer.
Okay, Brian, could you talk a little bit more about the comment that you put there? I think I agree with Dr. Paz. It would be good to discuss a little bit.
I think, again, I think my comments is really saying, to make a positive statement, like a confidentiality statement, having that out there, sometimes it's much more difficult to have that, to be able to articulate what we want to say by having a statement, but then to have a disclaimer to say what is not being covered, right? So it's just sort of, we don't have to make a confidentiality statement if we have a good disclaimer. One is proactive, the other one is reactive. I think it's important to know that as institutions, we have the ability to do both. And sometimes it's easier to coin terms in the negative as opposed to the positive. That's simply what I meant, so.
I think I agree with that, and it maybe a statement talking about you're guarding the confidentiality of everyone. One of the questions that was on here a minute ago was, I have to tell parents which teachers are vaccinated, and I responded, no, you don't. Because let's remember, it's not just the students and the parents that have confidentiality rights, but so do our employees, and so do we. I'm sure that many of you listening have been asked some very personal questions. And I've responded to some people, that's a personal question, I decline to answer. So thank you, Father Brian. And I think we have some more questions, Jonathan.
Sure. This is a question coming from the chat. Some dioceses have published policies regarding gender identity of students. Others have internal processes without publishing policies. What have you experienced and what do you advise regarding whether to publish a policy on this or not?
There's another question also about transgender up there, so maybe I can put them together. My recommendation is based on a number of experiences, but I'll share it with you. I was at the NCEA maybe 7 years ago, and someone came up to me and said, I want to tell you a story. And he said, whatever you do, tell it anywhere you want, but don't say where you got it. So I've tried to honor that. He said that he was first year superintendent, and one of the Catholic schools had a student that wanted to present as the opposite sex. And they let the individual do that. There was no problem in the school community. But someone in the parish got really upset, and Father Brian, I have no idea how you do this, filed a complaint with the Vatican. And it went through some legal process there. He said, finally, he got called from somebody at the Vatican, Monsignor somebody, who said, I'm going to ask you a question. Just answer the question, yes or no. Do you have a policy on transgender? He said no. The next question was, do you have any policy at all about the equal treatment of students? And he said, yes, we have a policy says that we try to accommodate the needs of students where we can. The Monsignor said, thank you very much. You will not hear from me again, and hung up. Now, I'd have to go to Father Brian to say if that's the kind of thing that you might expect from the Vatican. But I think it's safer to not start talking about transgender in your parent-student handbook, because you're going to invite all kinds of responses that you may not have time to deal with. Father Brian, I'm going to ask you to weigh in on that.
Well, I certainly would hope that the Vatican have enough work to do, that they would not be dealing with individual questions like this. What I have heard in the past is that people who are upset about these kind of situations would refer to their local bishops, which probably happen more often than not, right? So to go directly to the Vatican and then having the Vatican respond, I mean, that's a miracle, right? At the level of Jesus, not at the level of human being. So again, but whatever it is, right? I think, we need to remember, right? Catholic schools are operated by diocesan institutions as well as religious, school run by religious institutes, right? These institutions have missions, right? Have clear, articulated charism. Whatever policy we have, right, should be consistent with those missions, right? Whether we articulate it or not. So I would, again, agree with what Sister Angie said about, having a policy about treating students, educating the whole person, all of that, as opposed to having individual specific policy about transgender or not, right? So I think we need to rely on our mission, both collectively as Catholic schools, as well as the mission of our institute. So for example, if you're at a Jesuit school, if you're at a Dominican school, right, you are governed or you are guided by the Dominican or the Ignatian charism. Does the policy is the policy of your school consistent with that mission? And again, you can use that as a litmus test about, should we be doing this? Should we not be doing something? Is to go back to what is your particular charism? What is your particular mission? And is it consistent with it? As opposed to having policy statement, because again, you can do policy statement to the cow comes home and it will not cover everything under the sun. So have general statement, and that covers things a whole lot more than having specific.
Sister Dale, I know you have some experience with this.
As I always say, our obligation is to be both pastoral and principled. And if we could figure out what that means, we'll have no problems. But right now, that means different things to different people. And what happens is really guided by the local level. You know, what is the policy that the bishop has put in place for the diocese, formally or informally? Many of them have informal. And, you know, right now, I think the best policy is to deal with individual cases individually as the case presents itself. And to work through, if you're a principal, you know, the superintendent's office and the diocesan attorney, the bishop and the attorneys, you know, because some of this may wind up to be a civil rights lawsuit. You know, it's at this point, there are so many extenuating circumstances into, you know, how this is happening, you know, what is the family's stake? I mean, by and large, private schools, Catholic schools have a right to be a Catholic school. And no person has a right to attend a Catholic school or a right to teach in a Catholic school. You know, so that part of the admissions and part of the employment is that you support the mission of the school. So however that plays out, you know, we're dealing with church teaching, church law, and, you know, a whole pastoral process that gets jumbled together in some ways. And so I right now, I think the best possible solution is to work case by case and try to be consistent in how you deal with the cases, given what the circumstances are. But other than that, there's no real clear, because, you know, in the canons and in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, they, even though they talk about this as, you know, disordered in some way when they're talking about dysphagia, but the first premise is that we treat persons according to our belief in the dignity of each person. And so we have to honor that first and foremost. So there's no easy answer to this. And there are probably as many opinions as there are cases.
Probably more opinions and cases.
Yeah, yes, because you do get outsiders who have no direct involvement with the case, but know the answer. Yeah.
Mary,
Can I
how about,
also-
can you give us, oh, I'm sorry, Father Brian, go ahead.
Yep. Can I just do a little pitch here about canon law? The issue comes up sometime when you're asking, well, which law governs, right? So as a Catholic institution, right, local law governs, federal law governs, right? As a Catholic institution, if you are a parochial school, a school attached to a parish, right, then you need to pay attention to what the diocesan law is. We call that particular law, right? If you are a school that is operated by a religious institute, you're governed by what is called proper law, the law of your religious institute, as well as particular law, the law of the diocese, right? So it's important that you are aware, you know, so you want to go with the local first. So if, you know, at a Dominican school, it's the Dominican rule that governs you and your school, but because you're in the diocese, then the diocesan law covers you next. So you want to go up that level, right? So start with the proper, go to the particular, then go to the universal law, right? So I think oftentimes religious running schools, we forget the fact that we're governed, our schools, how our schools operate is governed by our proper law first. And bishop needs to respect that proper law, because that is what that is the role of proper law in the larger context of universal canon law. So make sure you know which realm you are operating in, and then some question may be important to be asked first at the level of the local level, which is the proper law. So keep that in mind. I just want to pitch that in just to let people just to know that things are much more complicated than federal or state.
Thank you. Mary, I was just wondering if you have anything to add from the superintendent's viewpoint.
What I would add is to encourage schools to have a conversation with the superintendent's office, that you're not alone on an island. And particularly when you talk about consistency and the opportunity for the pastoral to interact, it's very important that these instances be brought to the attention of council, so, and as well as the superintendent, as well as, you know, the vicar general, so that they can, you know, look at everything on each one on an individualized case by case basis to really arrive at what is the best decision in that circumstance.
Okay, Jonathan?
There's a follow-up question there that your previous answers would probably apply, but if there's anything to add, it says, what would be appropriate if the situation is a same-sex couple enrolling a student?
Well, we have the Gray Buff situation still out there. And from a canonical standpoint, I have to defer to Father Brian, but as someone who, and if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's two schools in Indianapolis. One cathedral had one half of a gay couple, and Braebuff, which is Jesuit, had the other half of the gay couple. And the Archbishop directed them to terminate those people. Cathedral did, but Cathedral is a diocesan school. Braebuff didn't because it's a Jesuit school. And now I'm going to defer to you, Father Brian, if you don't mind, because you know the canonical process better than I do. But Braebuff still has the teacher, as far as I know, and the teacher was terminated at Cathedral.
So the two issues involved, right? The first issue is an issue of contract. Who has the authority to intervene, or who is a party to a contract? Because Cathedral is a diocesan school, ultimately the bishop can be involved in that contract question, right? So that's why I think Cathedral, under its canonical and legal structure, civil law legal structure, had to terminate that particular professor or that particular teacher. Rebuff, because it's a school, it's a Catholic school run by the Jesuits. It's not a diocesan school, right? And so really the bishop can't really be involved in that contractual question over at the school run by the Jesuits. But where the issue for the Jesuit school would be and the question that is being asked is that, where does the Catholic identity of a school comes from, right? For Cathedral, the Catholic identity comes from the diocese, because the diocese is the juridic entity that operates the school. For the Jesuit school, the Catholic identity, according to canon law, comes from the religious community. And so one of the things that the bishop did was that he withdrew, or he threatened to withdraw, the Catholic identity of Brebeuf. And because of that, Brebeuf Jesuit School appealed that decision to Rome, and it's working its way through Rome. No Monsignor has called to ask just two questions just yet. But I think the decision is being decided right now about, well, did the bishop has the authority? Did the bishop, does a diocesan bishop have the authority to take away the Catholic identity of a school operated by a religious institute of pontifical right? My opinion is that he doesn't, because the religious institute is separate from the diocese when it comes to how it operates its ministry and where its Catholic identity comes from. But again, we're still waiting for the decision from Rome. The question is being asked through the Congregation for Catholic Education, which is interesting, as opposed to Congregation for Religious or Congregation for Clergy. So that's where we are right now. Is the question is, where does the Catholic identity come from? Again, I mean, both school, right? The context is because it's a gay couple, but the legal question has nothing to do with the sexual orientation. The legal question, on one hand, is an issue of contract. Does the bishop has the authority to step in and intervene with a contractual issue of a school run by the diocese? The other one is not an issue of contract, but it's an issue of Catholic identity. So again, those two issues have very little to do with the sexual orientation of the teachers.
Dr. Paz? Thank you, Brian. Dr. Paz?
I'm seeing Jonathan's comment and Sister Margaret's comment in the chat about this question originally coming to the same-sex couple enrolling the child. And I'm seeing Lisa's beautiful comment in the Q&A that about embracing the child, because nothing in the hypo brought up the child's orientation. And I can't help but think, in tying to Lisa's comment, back to our invocation, when if you looked over Father's shoulder, he had a beautiful picture of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, not Father Pham, the invocation, as Jesus is the Good Shepherd. And I think, what would Jesus do? Jesus says best interest of the child, and we protect the child in all cases. So I don't know if there being any policy that would say otherwise, but I don't see the harm in enrolling the child. We would want as many children in Catholic schools as possible.
Dr. Paz, I agree with you. Sister Dale?
Well, I just know of some dioceses that have admitted students who come from a same-sex marriage, but have conversations with the parents that the church teaching is not going to be modified, and that it may be uncomfortable for the student, and that the parent, when they are discussing tenets of faith, so that the parent would not be blindsided. If you choose to enroll your student here, this is, what he or she will be part of as part of the teachings, hear it. So it can be problematic.
To answer that question just a little more, again, my experience with our high schools is that it's not the gay couple with the child who's enrolled in the school. That's not where the issue comes from. It's the other parents, the parents who are uncomfortable of having their children in class with a child who has a same-sex parent situation. So oftentimes it's how do you put out fire, or how do you manage, or how do you become more pastoral to parents who are uncomfortable with the fact that there are children in their school who come from same-sex marriage situation.
Yes, Dr. Paz.
Father Brian's thought made me think of, okay, what do you do if those parents feel uncomfortable because one parent is involved in an interracial marriage? And then bringing it back to where Sister Angie and Father Brian took the original question, relating to, for example, the Brebeuf example in Indiana. With that ties to, and I don't know if one of the other panels in the symposium has talked about, the Our Lady of Guadalupe case and the Beale case, which were jointly decided by the Supreme Court, relating to are teachers also ministers? Are they catechists? And the justice's ruling on this functionality test and the right to dismissal, even when there was one claim of age discrimination and the other claim of an ADA claim, and the Supreme Court ruling in favor of the church's right. I don't know if that was discussed.
I do discuss that in the presentation I gave yesterday, if you want to access that.
Right.
I think it's a very good point, Dr. Paz, that the decision not to really hear the case was based on the upholding the ministerial exception from the Hosanna Tabor case, which is, I think, but about 10 years ago now. The ministerial exception says that if the person performs, as you know, a ministerial function, then the rules are different, and Catholic schools and other religious schools can make a decision on that. Many years ago, when I was a high school principal, I put in my handbook, and honestly, I'm thinking about it now, I don't even know why I did, but I put in, if you teach at Our Lady of Nazareth Academy, you are a teacher of religion. By what you do. And I remember somebody came to me and said, but you have a Jewish teacher on the faculty. I said, yes, I do. He teaches Old Testament, but he's still teaching religion by who we are and what we do. And I found that people who were not Catholic were very careful, and they would come and ask questions before they made statements in class. So I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Paz. Anybody else on that topic? Jonathan, we have any more questions?
There's a question here around student discipline. So speaking as a former public school leader, has there ever been a situation in a Catholic school where the parent would like to sue the school for disciplinary actions taken against their child that they felt were unjust? And what have been your experiences with cases like this?
Oh, there are lots of cases where people have tried. Some of them are not in, the opinions are not in the formal record, but going way back into the 70s, courts have been pretty consistent in saying that if you were in a private school, this private school determines the discipline. Now, my statement to some to some teachers when they get, or excuse me, principals, when they get in a situation is, if you think it's going to be really problematic, maybe you ought to consider giving the tuition back, because that would be the measure of damages, what they paid for the year. So once they would go to court, it'll be very hard to prove anything or to get any other relief. However, that's not going to stop people from going to court. I always say the ignominy is not in being sued, it's in being sued successfully. I think that courts are taking a wide berth when they start looking at independent schools. And I don't know of any Catholic school discipline case, student-wise, that reached the Supreme Court. I think there's a real unwillingness to look at this. Look at any kind of case involving private school discipline. Now, we did have that case that Dr. Paz referred to, which we got the ruling in December about one involved a teacher who said her contract was not renewed because they wanted somebody younger. And the other one was a lady who had breast cancer and said that her contract wasn't renewed because she'd been out so much. In the meantime, she died, and her husband carried the case, but the court, it wasn't very long, said that it falls under the ministerial exception. So, and I think with the makeup of the present Supreme Court, we're not going to see much deviation from that. No. Ryan, do you?
In both those cases, the school and the Archdiocese eventually, alleged that it was performance, that they were not fulfilling the contractual duties. And what I thought was very encouraging for us is that basically the court said it would not substitute its judgment for that of the professionals in the school who are, so that, we keep good documentation and we can make a case for, what we say, despite what the opposition may say, we're safe. I mean, the unfortunate thing is it may cost you a fortune to be right, so, it's easier to be proactive ahead of time and try to, particularly in the disabilities cases, being informed about what you can and can't do, and having people be reasonably accommodating can go a long way to saving you. As I tell people, you may win, but it's going to cost you a fortune to get there.
Mary?
I would add that when you have a discipline case where you're looking at expulsion, on the front end, to Sister Dale's point of documentation, what we always do is we say to the principal, why do you wish to expel? What is the action? What has led up to it? What types of warnings have there been? What does the school handbook say about this behavior? What is your discipline policy as put in your school handbook? And then the principal makes the decision with support from our office, typically to expel, and then the parent always is granted a limited right of appeal, where they're sent the letter where the student is expelled, and the parent has the right, usually within 10 days or so, to have a limited hearing, which is certainly not a judicial proceeding by any means, but they come here to our office and they have a hearing with the superintendent. So the superintendent's not involved in the expulsion decision. That's done usually by the assistant or associate superintendent, and then it's the superintendent who hears the appeal, generally with the student, depending on their age. Usually it's an older student, and then the parents, and then the superintendent renders their decision. So there is some due process in the procedure.
Thank you. I think we have one more question, and then we might have a few closing statements from the panelists. Jonathan?
There were a few comments regarding the recent Supreme Court ruling on free speech and how that affects schools and dioceses in limiting social media posts about the school, teachers, or students, outside of school hours.
Okay, that cheerleading case, of course, was a public school case. And I believe that what we ought to do is to put something in our handbooks for teachers and students that says basically, you're a Catholic school teacher, you're a Catholic school student, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. What you do reflects back on the school. And so the school can discipline you for what you put on social media. And I know any number of cases where kids have made statements about blowing up something or something like that, and the schools required them to withdraw. That is what many people are doing rather than expelling. They're requiring the parents to withdraw the students so they don't have to put expelled on it. We all know that adolescents and younger children are at formative stages of life. They make mistakes. But there's some things, if you do them, you can't take them back. I don't think that the cheerleader case really has much to say about Catholic schools. It was always the same as far as I can tell, that we could have a separate discipline ruling. It's interesting that the Supreme Court came up with this since the last time this kind of thing was discussed was in 2012, and it was in West Virginia, and there were two cases with almost identical facts about social media postings. And in one case, the West Virginia court ruled for the student. In another case, the West Virginia court ruled for the school. That's public school. And it's taken this long, 10 years, for us to get a decision from the Supreme Court that's on point, but it's public school. Anyone else want to comment on that at all? Dr. Paz?
I'm completely in agreement with Sister Angie on this, and your policy, your handbook is what's going to save you. And going back to what Mary said, some semblance of due process can certainly help. Notice and an opportunity to be heard. And if anything, from the human behavior factor, sometimes the parent just needs somebody else to confirm what they were told earlier, which sometimes is, and you sometimes hate to have to say it, but you have to tell somebody you're wrong. Maybe when they hear it the second time, they will give in.
Okay.
They have to be able to express themselves.
Thank you. I just realized that Mary's the only parent on our panel. So Mary, do you have any thoughts from the parent point of view? Mary has 4 children.
Yes, thank
So
you.
she should be an expert.
I think parents obviously want to believe the best of their children, and it's sometimes we see the us against the world view from parents. And so to be able to have that conversation with the parents to say, this is what our handbook says, you do represent the school even when you're off campus, and to help them see what the effect of the language is. Yes, the child did it, in anger, and younger ages, children have access to social media and they post things even though they're below the age of 13. So I would say it's a constant education piece. Common Sense Media is a really good outlet that has a lot of suggestions for parents and for schools in talking to parents about monitoring social media. And it really comes down to how well parents are able to monitor their children's social media and understanding the consequences that can come from comments that really are beyond the pale.
Thank you. I think we're going to move into any last thoughts, and then we will end this. But I know I speak for everybody. If you want to get in touch with us, we'll be happy to be of any service to you. So Father Brian, can I start with you? Any last thoughts?
again, I mean, my only thought about all of this would be just be aware about which world you are operating in, the secular world, the canon law, with the church world. So know your jurisdiction, know which law applies when, and be able to maneuver and pivot between or among those different levels of legal systems. So know though that as Catholic institutions, we operate under at least two different legal systems, and they do not always go hand in hand. So just be aware of that. Thank you, sister.
Mary?
Thank you, sister. I'd just like to add that sometimes schools and principals and teachers feel that they're a little bit of an island, that this is all happening to them. And to just take a breath and remember that you're not alone in this, and there are resources there to help you, particularly if you're part of, a religious institution. What offices are in place there? The legal counsel for the religious institution, a diocesan school, diocesan council, the superintendent's office can certainly give you practical advice and lead you in the right direction to connect with counsel. But to really think about the practical and the theoretical and how they are supposed to meet up in the law. And so that's what I would say, to encourage, everyone to reach out for advice and help as you need it. And thank you very much, sister. It's always a pleasure and an honor to be on this panel.
Thank you, Mary. Dr. Paz?
Thank you, sister. I can't help but, first of all, the policy manual, I can't emphasize that enough. I want to go back to what Sister Dale said in terms of the headache of a lawsuit, and tying that with what Mary said. And diplomacy goes a long way. Sometimes when Mary mentioned the child being angry, sometimes the child is reflecting what the child has learned at home. And your problem there is the parent. And Sister Angie mentioned formative years. We are all in formative years. 30 years from now, if I'm still alive, I will still be in a formative year and learning. So these parents that are angry, and it's expressed through the child, they're still growing up too. So sometimes diplomacy, hearing them out and disarming them, is going to save you from the headache of the lawsuit, as Sister Dale mentioned.
Thank you. Sister Dale?
Thank you for having me as part of this panel. Listening to these summary comments, my thought was, as schools, we operate in both the state and church levels, and in my mind, I'm thinking, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's. And that, we do need to engage in the public arena, both in policy and in participation in all the federal programs. I have a whole lot on my recorded piece about all this COVID relief money that's floating around, and we're entitled to that, and we should respect that and go for it. But at the same time, we also, have our obligations to be part of church, to be pastoral in how we approach students and families. And so I encourage us to remember we're in a dualistic role as school, but first things first.
Thank you, Sister Dale. And I'd just like to thank the panelists very much for being here. Thank you, Jonathan, for leading us through this and the technology issues. He's been wonderful. I would like to say that in my recorded talk, I discussed some of the issues that we're talking about here. And I don't want to repeat what anybody else said, but I like to say what I always say, which is that, and you took one of them, which is render unto Caesar, but that's a really good one. That's all right. I think we've got to remember to pray. It's very easy to forget about that, and because we're so busy, but we need to take at least a few minutes every morning and put ourselves in the presence of God and ask for God's help in the days and in our work. And then I think we have to ask ourselves that question, what would Jesus do? Sometimes we forget that question. And I know that Jesus didn't run schools, as a Jesuit brother of yours pointed out to me once, but what would he do if he were here? I think those are good questions. And I think if we keep in mind the things we've discussed today, but always remember God first, last, and always will stay well within the demands of the law and the requirements of the gospel. Thank you all very much for joining us. Hope to see you again soon. Bye.
Okay, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you to our panelists. Check out the online event page on Eventbrite for more information. You'll see links to the on-demand sessions and recordings from the live schedule will be posted in the coming days. So stay tuned for that. And we invite you to give us your feedback on the session survey and symposium evaluation. So we'd love to hear from you. So thanks everyone. Go ahead.
Hopefully
Sister.
we'll see you, hopefully we'll see you in Louisville next summer for the
You will see
20th
us in Louisville
anniversary
next summer.
program.
For our 20th annual Education Law Symposium back at the Brown Hotel. Thank you.
Thanks everyone. God bless.
Bye.
Thank you.